Welcome everybody. It's Thursday night at the Natural History Society of Maryland. Tonight, we are going to learn about Maryland's state drink. The state drink of Maryland happens to be milk. And we have Dr. Michael Power with us from the National Smithsonian Institute. He is the curator of the exotic milk collection. There is the largest collection of exotic milks in the world. And it is pretty fascinating to understand how all milk is not created equal. They're very, very different from each other, but all very important, a key component to what makes a mammal a mammal. So I'm going to turn it over right now to Dr. Power. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us this evening.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and let's see if I can find, now that I can share my screen, what can I find here? And you can all tell me if you can see my opening slide. Good. Okay. So sort of a cheeky title. So I'm going to take you over a 300 million year journey of when we think lactation and milk started and ending in the present and seeing what milk is now. And I guarantee you that it's going to be a real fast zip through the first 299 plus million years. Okay. But I just want to give you a feel for how ancient and important lactation and milk is to the mammalian lineage. So if we go back, if we jumped into our Wayback Machine and got back in time and in space, 300 million years ago and looked at the Earth, this is what we think we would see. All right, the continents are all coming together. They're actually continually crashing together in here, most of them more toward the southern hemisphere and all into one side of the planet. If you look at that, what you can kind of see is there's a huge amount of shoreline, a huge amount of very shallow sea, a lot of wonderful areas there for what basically is turning into the incursion, the final incursion of land by vertebrates. So the plants had already gotten on land, the insects had already gotten on land. About 340 million years ago, the vertebrates actually start trying to crawl up on land. And they're basically doing so in these coastal areas, the shallow seas, a lot of things going on like that in there. Okay. So a very important adaptation occurs about this time, roughly about 340 million years ago or so, and it's called the amniotic egg. So it's a change in the structure of the egg in terms of reproduction, where you're gaining three extra embryonic membranes, the chorion, the amnion, and the allantois. Okay, and this occurs if can you actually see my cursor when I go like this? Yeah, so there he is. There's the amniotic egg. So we've got your lungfish, you've got your first tetrapods coming off, your amphibians here. They're still tied to water. Here's a very important adaptation, basically in a sense, is having to help lay eggs on land. These extra membranes in there actually allow, to an sense, the eggs to not have to be in water, actually potentially be on land. And there are two basic lineages of amniots. There's the sauropsid lineage, which goes up this way. Get my people out of the way there. And all of my reptiles. And yes, that means that cladistically birds are reptiles. Birds are warm-blooded reptiles with feathers. They're all the sauropsid lineage. And then there was another lineage, the synapsid lineage. So synapsids and sauropsid all basically occurred at this time and split. The only descendants of these ancient synapsids are the mammals. Okay. And I'll actually make an argument that the reason why that lineage got through was actually because of the ancient adaptation of lactation, that was actually an important adaptation that allowed them to continue to be successful. And of course, in modern day, they're quite successful at this point. So if we go 20 million years toward the future, you're seeing the continents continually collide together. And what's happening? Well, you're starting to lose those shallow seas. You're losing some of your coastline. You're gaining more and more interior land. So you're getting more and more land away from water and less of these shallow seas that was the sort of breeding ground of all this wonderful stuff from 340 to 300 million years ago with the tetrapods coming out. And that both causes a challenge because you're losing habitat, but it causes an opportunity because you're gaining a different kind of habitat. And here we're talking about, these are the theories and hypotheses of Dr. Olaf Oftedal, who I actually started working with. He was one of my mentors in this thing on there. And he proposed very early on that the most early function of lactation is actually water balance. And not just water balance for offspring, but water balance for eggs. Basically, this is a means by which a group of these synapsids were able to effectively, the adults are able to transport water from where they can go get it and bring it to their nest, to their eggs. And so you basically, if you went back in time, if you flew back in time and got out there and grabbed a mother synapsid, you'd probably find a lizardy looking thing that has a weird sort of gland on her ventrum that was leaking fluid. And it probably wouldn't look like milk to you, all right? But it's the antecedents of what's going on. But of course, as soon as you do that, as soon as you're sitting there having moisture on the skin of the mother and the moisture on the eggs, and probably heat as well, it's quite possible synapsids were at least decent homeotherms, you're going to have to worry about fungal and bacterial infections because you're basically creating a perfectly good environment now for fungi and bacteria to grow. So very quickly, if it's going to be successful adaptation, you're going to have the antimicrobial molecules that also come in. And some of those are things like lysozyme. Lysozyme C is a very ancient molecule, and we still find it in milk. Okay, so there's many of these molecules we still find in milk and exist in there. Eventually, you probably start getting some nutrition absorbed through the shell. We know what happens in lizard eggs, actually. It may just be minerals, it may be just a few things. But what that ends up doing is all this ends up allowing that the egg nutrients to be reduced on laying and increased development occur before hatching as the mother essentially is bringing stuff to. And that's to a certain extent what happens in the monotremes. The monotremes have an egg within them for about 7 days, and then the egg is outside being essentially for a while longer, and then it hatches and the milk comes in. But there's a whole set of different ways in which we can get nutrition through. These are called parchment shell eggs. These are not eggshells like a bird. Birds solve the problem of desiccation by getting a calcified shell that resists desiccation. All right, the synapses never developed that. You then actually have an easy way if you have what looks like, and as far as we can tell, this is probably the females doing it. We have no evidence whatsoever of any kind of male parental behavior attached to lactation. So if you have maternal behavior going on with the eggs, it's pretty easy to see how that would extend after hatching. So after hatching, you just have to keep that secretion going and the offspring eating on it. And then you start getting more and more nutrition getting added. And then we start adding other bioactive compounds. And then the other thing that I always want to say is that all our evolution for all time everywhere has been with microbes in there. We're getting so much into microbiomes right now. So a lot of my research right now is actually turning into microbiome research because we have co-evolved with microbes for so incredibly long. We cannot not think of the evolution of lactation with the idea that there have been microbes that have been along, either being combated or possibly being helpful the entire way in this picture. So I'm now going to leap away from the ancient stuff, which I said would probably have looked like proteinaceous spit to you or something. I mean, it wouldn't really look like milk. And now we're going to look at what modern milk is, and we're going to sit there and say, what is in it? What are the various things in this? And it's an extremely complex biochemical fluid. In fact, about 15 years ago, I talked to a geneticist who wanted desperately to know what was in milk because he had a strain of, he was a geneticist, he had a genetic strain of obese mice. But he said, Mike, if I take the pups from the obese mom and put them on a normal mom, they don't end up obese. And so the pups actually seem to follow the lactator, their nursing mom, more than their actual genetic mom. And at the time he asked me what was in it, and I sort of said, man, there's lots of stuff in there. And he says, none of the biochemists I talked to will even touch it because they say it's too complicated. The fun thing now is technology has moved on. We're actually able to measure more and more of the things in here. We're actually able to start getting at this stuff. So first of all, we'll start with water, of course. Water was probably the initial thing. Water is still incredibly important. A mammalian neonate will die of dehydration far before it will die of starvation. So water, of course, is an important part in there. Then we have, of course, all the nutritional aspects you have. You have your macronutrients. I'm going to talk mostly about the macronutrients in this talk today, the protein, fat, sugar, some about minerals. But of course, there's also vitamins. There's all sorts of micronutrients. Milk is indeed an incredibly good food, okay? But it's not just a food. There's a whole set of immune factors, of course, that are in that are coming to it. A large part of a neonate's immune response is delivered to it by its mother in the very first days, okay? And not only that, milk in the mammary gland and then getting into the infant actually contains alive maternal immune cells. These are actually functioning immune cells, which are producing all of those molecules plus acting as immune cells. So there's a whole immune system that's, first of all, helping the mammary gland, keeping the mammary gland safe, but also has some positive effects on the infant as well. Okay. I'll step back up again briefly to the macronutrients, and here's lactose. So this is what we call milk sugar. Everybody knows sort of heard of lactose before. It's milk sugar. What it is, it's a glucose molecule bounded to a galactose molecule. And it turns out that this is unique in nature. You cannot find lactose anywhere except in a mammary gland and in milk. And that's because if you put glucose and galactose together in a solution, glucose will bind to glucose and galactose will bind to galactose, and it is not biochemically appropriate for them to bind to each other. The energetics doesn't work unless there's an enzyme that gets in there. There is an enzyme in milk that allows this sugar. So there's an incredibly, absolutely unique sugar in milk, okay, that's being developed for these things. There's prebiotic and antibiotic factors. Prebiotic means these are things that are helpful to microbes. So there's a whole bunch of discussion now about human milk oligosaccharides, in that a number of the human milk oligosaccharides are not feeding the baby. They're actually feeding the microbes in the baby's gut. And they're actually preferred food for those microbes, and other microbes can't eat them. But there's also antibiotic factors that are actually attacking various microbes as well. So there's both things going on. There's signaling molecules, there's hormones, there's cytokines, there's even microRNA. Of all human biofluids, milk has the highest concentration of microRNAs. Now, we don't know exactly what they're doing. They just may be in there. All right, we haven't figured out whether they're actually signaling or not, but there's a potential huge rate of signaling that can be occurring, so that this milk actually may be causing actual physiological responses in the infant beyond that of nutrition going on here. Enzymes. Most mammalian neonates don't produce all of the enzymes they necessarily need at the beginning, but in part they don't have to, because some of those enzymes are actually built into the milk proteins. So in the milk fat globule, it's a lipoprotein membrane around the milk fat. That's how it's encapsulated. When that hits the stomach, acidity breaks it down and starts breaking up, denaturing some of the proteins, and causes peptide fragments. And some of those peptide fragments are biologically active, and they're actually lipases and proteinases. So milk is not only delivering food to the baby, but it's actually delivering some of the ability to actually digest that food to the baby at the same time. And then finally, yes, there are microbes. We used to think that milk was sterile. Milk is a semi-protected organ. Not every microbe can get in there. In fact, they're they can, and it's called mastitis, and it's not a good thing. So there is a defense against microbes by the mammary gland, but it's not complete. And in fact, it looks like there's some regulation going on in there, such that some microbes are actually preferentially allowed in. So to me, in the broadest sense, milk is a means by which mammalian mothers are are signaling biochemically to their offspring in order to guide their growth and development. It is the ancient adaptation of mammals to do this, to actually have the biochemical signaling from the mother to be over an extended period of time and possibly to be able to be changed either with time or circumstances. So of course, all mothers give their offspring biochemical information. A hen puts a huge amount of biochemical information into that egg before she lays it. But once she's put it in, she can't change it. She can't change it. She can't add to it. She can't do anything else. The interesting thing that I think is an adaptive feature of mammals is they have this extended period of maternal signaling, which allows this potentially variable control over the development of their offspring. And maybe some of you have heard of the phrase development origins of health and disease. It's a big thing in modern medicine now. It says that it's one of the reasons why we think, sadly, as modern human beings, we have more cardiovascular disease and diabetes and everything, is because we're actually got ourselves into a circumstance that's not ideal, and early on insults to our life result in bad health later in life. To me, this is just an aspect of the actual positive adaptive nature of being a mammal. It's one of the things that the mammalian lineage is good at, is that if you had a fertilized egg that was going to be born and you could somehow split it into 2 timelines and treat that mother differently, you would end up getting a different offspring at the end, depending on the circumstances, because it's allowing that variation to occur. To me, that's the power of milk. The other thing, of course, I want to get across is that lactation is incredibly expensive. It is the most expensive piece of mammalian reproduction. And this is a picture of the same cow and calf. On the left is on the day of birth, and on the right is 6 months later. And you've gone from an extremely almost obese mom to someone whose ribs are showing. And that's an incredible demonstration of the transfer of maternal resources to her offspring, which is, again, that's what lactation is. An amazing transfer of maternal resources to offspring. Very successful, but don't let anybody tell you that lactation is not expensive, because it is. It costs females quite a bit in terms of that. So we have the exotic animal milk repository. We sort of throw the word animal in there because we do have a few of the quirky things like the pigeon and dove crop milks. They're not really milk, but they're the same sort of thing. We have some of those in our we basically have samples from over 200 species. Total number of samples are over, I think, 16,000 at this point. Many of them are old and not great shape, but we've got 3,000 or 4,000 in the -80 freezer that are pretty much pristine, which is cool because those are the ones I can use for all the fancy new stuff now, like proteomics and all the big gee whiz technology that we have to measure stuff. And yes, I have milk from every single one of those species there, including human. Yes, humans are mammals as far as I'm concerned. They're simply one of many. And we do have human milk in our collection as well. So the functions of the milk repository, the base one that most people understand and probably gets the most publicity, is we're basically generating a huge database of macronutrient content of milks of all sorts of different species, because although we want mothers to always raise their babies, it can't always happen. We have situations where babies, for whatever reasons, including maternal death, all sorts of different things can happen, where we actually have to hand rear animals, in which case we at the very least want to follow the wonderful Hippocratic saying of first do no harm. First, we want to give them milk as close to what their poor intestinal tract is expecting and their physiology is expecting as we possibly can. Okay. So if the picture up there in the right-hand corner, that's Fiona the hippo. I don't know if you ever know of Fiona the hippo, but very famous, has made Cincinnati Zoo tons and tons of money. Of course, we helped create the milk formula because they were able to get milk samples from Fiona's mom, and we analyzed those in there to help with this successful rearing of this baby on there. So those are the base one, and one of the reasons why we continually get milks and continually simply churn out the nutrients and look at it just so that we can build these databases so that we can be useful in that sense. I'm more of a basic scientist, so I'm more interested in the other two aspects of this. I'm very much interested in looking at the evolutionary history of milk composition. And so there's a little cladogram to the right there, a little phylogeny. We're actually going to zoom in on that at some point, and I'll see pieces of it. And what I'm trying to do is track back from different species to what the ancestral milk might be. I'm trying to go back in time, because at some point in time, we're going to get to a place where there was a milk of placental mammals. And then there was a milk of all the mammals before. And then, so as you go further and further back in time, eventually you're going to get to a milk, even though I have lots now. And so I'm looking for those patterns and looking for trying to figure out why different species have different milks and where they may have come from and what the consistencies are to try to track back to them. And the other thing we're hitting right now is of course, the signaling potentials of milk beyond nutrients, because we now have the technology to measure these things. So we're looking at more of the stuff. And in fact, we're doing a huge amount of stuff right now on milk microbiome, which is pretty interesting because it really is actually turning out that it looks like the milk microbiome is relatively species specific, at least within certain areas. In other words, so you're not going to expect in that little pictures down below, which I can't see right now because people's things there, but which one would it be? This one right here. These are elephants. Those are African elephants and those are Asian elephants. And those are other Afrotheria. Those are the aardvarks, and then there's a manatee there. But they're all falling apart in different places. As in, it looks like the species of microbes in the milk actually seem to be affected by the species of the animal that's doing it. And there's a consistency there. And we're trying to look at what those patterns are looking at. So from now on, though, I'm going to talk mostly about just the nutritional component of milk. Okay. We're looking at nutritional properties. The first thing I want to talk about is that milk fat is the most variable. So you can have milk fat ranging from 0.5% in a white rhino to, if you go out to a hooded seal, milk fat there's more fat than water. There's 50 to 60% of that milk is fat. Completely different looking. Another aspect of the properties of milk, though, is that I've seen here is this concept. Low fat milks are going to be high in sugar. High fat milks are going to be low in sugar. So I always tell people that if you want ice cream, you have to go to the store and buy it because nature cannot make it. Okay, it's a made thing. And the basic reason of that is that the sugar in milk creates an osmotic gradient that draws intracellular water into the mammary gland. And so if you have a lot of sugar in the milk, you're going to draw a lot of water into the mammary gland. And it doesn't matter how much fat you try to put in there. You're going to keep diluting it. You're going to end up with what looks like a lower fat milk. And if you want a high fat milk, you've got to keep the sugar low. Otherwise, the water will come in. So sugar basically drives the water content of the milk. So that's the other way of putting it. Low sugar, low water content, high sugar, high water content in milk. So we're going to look first at a dilute milk. So we're going to look at the white rhinoceros, and that's a very large megafauna terrestrial herbivore that appears to be able to grow a large calf very quickly. These calves grow at about 1 kilo a day on a milk that's almost 91% water. 91% water, about 6 to 8% sugar, protein sitting in there at about 1%, fat, like I say, at 0.5% at best, right? So this is so first of all, you can probably imagine in your mind that there's an awful lot of water going from mom to calf here. For the amount of nutrition it's getting, it's a huge amount of water going through there and not all that much nutrition. But it's successful, right? It works. It grows a large calf that's going to be this herbivore on the maternal diet. It works. It works for the calf. So now we're going to do a comparison with another large terrestrial herbivore of about the same size, the Asian elephant. And here we're going to see a milk that looks quite different. And I always like to bring this up because it's a classic biological, to me, truism. There's never a single solution to any of these biological challenges that species are facing. And in fact, I usually say that if you come up with a biological challenge, tell me how many species are facing it, and that's approximately a good estimate of how many solutions there probably are. And they'll be different. And so It looks like Asian elephant. It's much higher in solids, so it's lower in water, much more fat, much more protein, much less sugar, of course, because that's how it, right? That's the way it's going in there. But obviously, it's also a successful strategy, right? And in fact, the calves grow at almost exactly the same rate as a rhino calf. So I have two different ways of growing things. So I want to actually look at this in a little more detail to try to see that even though these milks look different, there's something fundamentally biologically similar between them because they're both solving the same problem. They're both getting the same result. Asian elephant milk also is interesting in the fact that it changes over time. So that one picture I showed you, there was just as a snapshot in time. But as the calf ages, it gets higher and higher in milk, gets higher and higher fat, higher and higher in protein. And of course, the sugar goes down. So if fat's going up, that means it's very consistent, very nice. So it looks though, actually, even within the elephant, that calf looks like it's getting different milk at different ages. Okay. But it still actually grows pretty linearly. The growth in the Asian elephant is pretty much of 800 grams to a kilogram a day, all through that time period. So I'm going to take a little brief sidestep into mathematics here, into what we call the geometric framework, which is a very useful framework of looking at the relationships among the macronutrients in a food. Basically comes off the fact that we're going to look at the total amount of biological energy, the total amount of organic energy that's in a food, in this case milk. It works really well with milk. And it's pretty much going to come from the sugar, the fat, and the protein. That's what's going to give you your biological energy. So you can put the axes in any order you want. For this particular application, I put the sugar on the horizontal, the fat is on the vertical, and then the 45-degree lines are the isoclines of protein. All right, so I've graphed whole milk. If you went to the store and bought a carton of milk, that's what you're getting. You're getting about 44% of your energy from fat, 29.5% from sugar, 27.5% from protein. This blue line is the 27.5% from protein line. So if I move this dot up and down the line, I'd be changing my percentage of energy from fat and sugar, but not from protein. Right? So obviously I'm setting up this way because I'm going to show you something about elephant milk and rhino milk that's going to be on that protein line. So we'll look at the Asian elephant milk. So here it is, 3 months, 9 months, 18 months, 6 months. It's clearly getting less and less energy from sugar, more and more energy from fat, but it is energy from protein change? No. So it actually, as a scientist, I get excited when I see variation, and I get even more excited when I see a way to make some of that variation go away. And so now I've got a situation where it's saying, okay, that elephant milk is changing, but it's also staying constant in a way. So the amount of energy from protein is about 17%, and it doesn't matter what the age of the calf is. Now I'm going to put in the white rhinoceros, and yeah, it's definitely a different milk, isn't it? It's sugar. So rhino calves run on sugar, elephant calves run on fat, but they're all getting about the same protein. They're all sitting on, and which is why they grow the same. Now, there are obviously biological consequences, okay? So the estimate we have here is that white rhino mom has to produce 40 kilos of milk a day, which 36 of that is water. So you're pumping a lot of water through that baby, okay? That equals about 14,000 kilocalories. So that's our estimate of how much it takes. And that calf would get 420 grams of protein. The elephant, if you want to deliver the same amount at 3 months, because it changes, it depends on which month I pick, but at 3 months, that same amount of milk energy would only take 14 kilograms of milk and only 11.2 kilograms of water, but it would deliver exactly the same amount of protein. So if you think of this as a protein delivery device, in other words, as a protein source, rhino milk and elephant milk are the same in terms of a protein source. They just differ in where the metabolic energy to that calf is going to come from. It's either going to come from fat. The rhino, it's going to come from sugar. So I'm now going to go on the evolution side. So basically what I went through there was trying to show you how we approach comparing milks that look intrinsically different, figuring out ways of trying to put them together to see how can we see how they're similar and how they're not similar. In this case, I'm going to go to my other little favorite thing of saying, is there any way that I can attempt to recreate what an ancestral milk would look like? And what are the biological reasons for why milks went in different directions? So we're going to look at our wonderful little crazy South American mammals. So I got a 9-banded armadillo, a giant anteater, and a 2-toed sloth. If we look at our phylogeny here, so there's the whole break from the monotremes came off, there goes the marsupials, and here goes the eutherian mammals. So here we go, our placental mammals, we want to call them that. That's where they started, and then they branch off into all these 4 different superorders. And this is a huge superorder, right? This is huge, this is pretty big. Afrotheria is still okay in there. And you got your little dinky xenarthras here. They're sort of the small one out. That has an advantage to me, of course, because it's really hard to get all of these species. It's really hard to get all the branches in these. I have this side and this side, but I only have a single guy over here. I have aardvarks over there. That's the only one I have. But in here, I've got all the branches. I've got all the branches. I actually don't quite agree with this branching pattern they have. I'll have a different one you'll see there. But the idea is I want to look at this to see if I can figure out what maybe this node would look like. And see if that then gives me an indication of maybe what this node looks like. And of course, the one thing I want to do is I really want to get an idea of what maybe that milk looked like way back there. And again, investigating the biological reasons for why they may look like as they're doing it. So here's a phylogeny just of the Xenarthra. It's actually the one I liked better that puts all armadillos off on their own, and actually sloths and anteaters are actually branching off together here. They're called the pilosa. They're the ones with like good hairy fur, and you basically have an insectivore and an herbivore branch here, and then you have this insectivore branch over here. This is your armored one, right? This is the armored one with osteoderms. It's got the actual carapace in there. And we're going to start off by looking at the commonalities. So they're obviously all originated in South America. So there's a phylogenetic commonality here that they all came out of that. They have these unusual vertebral joints that have extra articulations, which is why they can curl up so well. So that's why an armadillo can actually curl in a ball. And the giant anteaters are nice and humped, and so they're very flexible in that way. That's where it's coming from. They are all low energy metabolism animals. Okay. Sloth is sort of your poster child, of course, for low energy, but all of them are basically on the low energy side for a mammal. And they all have diets that are low in energy and relatively high in protein. So the anteater, that's obvious. The armadillos, yes, they're mostly insectivores. But your sloth is an herbivore, but eats lots of mature leaves, which actually is very low in simple sugars. Lots of fiber, yes, but also relatively high in protein. Leaves run up to about 20% protein. And what I'm going to show you, I'm stating it here, but I'm going to show it to you, is all of their milks are high in protein. So they're basically a protein dominant milk is what we're looking at from all of those 3 different lineages. So we start off with our armadillos, 9-banded armadillos. This guy here in the picture is Frank Knight from the University of the Ozarks. It was his project that he set up. He was working on looking at keeping them in captivity and everything. And he was catching pregnant armadillos and bringing them in, having them give birth, because at the time, we apparently have a great deal of difficulty getting 9-banded armadillos to get pregnant in captivity, but you can catch them when they're pregnant and they give birth just fine and raise their babies just fine. And so when he did that, he said, well, we're going to sit there and anesthetize them and use a little pumping system here, and we're going to milk armadillos. Okay, so here's one way of milking armadillos. They actually came off with, they found it in the literature as something was used for hamsters or something, but some little pump and a syringe, and they quite successfully gathered quite a bit of milk from a whole bunch of different things on a nice schedule. So we have a longitudinal samples. This is what I love. not just a few animals in random times, but a bunch of animals at nice set times so I can see what's going on with the milk. All right. And so milk came up to the nutrition laboratory to where we put it through our system to do this. And there's all pictures of all my young people that flow through my lab. Most of the people who come in and do this work are basically interns and young contractors who all bustle off to grad school and leave me at some point in there. But Frank Knight himself brought a couple students up, and he himself actually did a lot of the work. He came in and learned, he got himself out of the field and came to the lab and learned how to do the lab work and actually did. And I had some of my good people making sure and helping him as well to make sure it all came out there. But he did a lot of the work in that himself. And what we found I thought was very interesting, and this is published in the Journal of Mammalogy. And again, it has a pattern that we can sort of recognize from the African elephant, where you've got an increase in fat and protein as the pup ages, with the associated decrease in sugar. Okay, so that seems reasonable. But what caught me when I first looked at it was how high the protein content was. I was used to most milks, either the sugar is the highest solid constituent or fat is the highest constituent. There are some species where fat and protein are pretty close, like African lion, fat and protein are pretty close to each other. But it's unusual, not unknown, but unusual to have protein to be the highest. And the extent to which it was highest is quite remarkable. So that really struck me and said, wow, that's an interesting milk going on here. And then the next one was certainly quickly more understandable, but also striking, was when I looked at the calcium and phosphorus content of the milk. Again, it's increasing with time in there. And calcium is always higher than phosphorus, which is a classic nutritional thing. To actually do proper metabolism and build bones and everything, you actually want your diet to have more calcium than phosphorus. The best ratio is at least 1:1 to 2:1, and most milks fall in the category about 1.5 to 1, calcium to phosphorus. And that's just some sort of physiology that works that way. And if you're just looking at it and you don't know milk, this just looks like a nice pattern, looks consistent, no big deal. But I know milks, I've seen lots of milks. This is higher calcium than some milks have total mineral content. Remember, my rhino milk had total mineral of 0.25%. That's the same as the phosphorus content here. And in fact, by the time I got here, my calcium content is more than 1% of the milk. That's more than the mineral content of most milks. So this is a huge amount of calcium and phosphorus that is in these milks. And if I look at it and go against protein, if I'm looking at the calcium and phosphorus content against protein, they show a very strong correlation. And now things are starting to make sense to me when I think of milk and saying, oh, I get it. First of all, the high calcium and phosphorus content kind of makes sense when you realize what a baby armadillo is building. It's not just building its internal skeleton, it's building an entire bony carapace that's going on there. So of course it has to have a large amount there. But then this aspect of it says, oh, now I'm starting to understand why I've got a high protein milk. And that comes down to the fact that if you take calcium and phosphorus molecules, atoms, and just dump them into a fluid or dump them into a glass of milk, what is going to happen is they're going to combine and make insoluble calcium phosphate molecules and precipitate out. And if you do that in the mammary gland, all you're going to do is screw up the mammary gland, kill the female, and never help the baby. So milk has actually evolved a means by which it can keep calcium and phosphorus in milk without that happening. And it's basically casein proteins. There's a set of casein proteins that basically build a little ball that surrounds nanoclusters of calcium and phosphorus. And that, by the way, is why milk looks white, because the size of the balls is about the right size to scatter all visible light. So you have basically what you're seeing is the scatter off all these little protein balls that contain calcium and phosphorus in there. So there's an aspect of protein that is not just nutrition in milk. The casein proteins have, as part of their function, they're a calcium phosphorus delivery device. And so if I'm going to have a huge amount of calcium and phosphorus in my milk to build that bone and carapace, I have to have a high protein milk. That's going to have to be a high casein protein milk. Okay? And then it leads me to think of saying, well, that implies that a high protein milk has to be a pre-adaptation to becoming an armadillo. You cannot evolve a lineage of armadillos if you're coming from a low protein milk. It's not going to work. Okay? So it also implies that armadillo pups are probably really good at using protein for metabolic energy, but they're an insectivore. I expect them to do that anyway. But that's because there's way more protein in this milk than is needed for growth. Because a lot of that protein, like I say, is a calcium phosphorus delivery device. So then let's take a look at one of the other species. All right, this thing doesn't make a bony carapace. All right, it makes a lot of fur. That's a lot of thick hair there, which also takes protein. But it's a very different critter, though it's an insectivorous critter. And they're just wonderful the way they carry their babies around. So here we had some samples from 2 different females. Actually, I had 3. I have some from our own female as well. So I now have samples from 3 different females in there. Did assay them the exact same way. Look at them. And what I found was, okay, it doesn't look really like armadillo milk. It's got a lot more water in it. Sugar, it's moderate, maybe a little higher than armadillo. Fat's pretty low. Okay, so it actually will increase over time. But again, protein doesn't look as high as the armadillo, but it's the highest constituent again. And actually, if you look at it in terms of how much of the energy it accounts for, it's an astounding 60% of the energy in milk is being accounted for by protein in this. Now this, again, look carefully, this is very early. This is the early parts of lactation. It goes on at least double that. They lactate for like 4 months. So this is the early part, and actually the milk does change a little bit. I'll get to that in there. So then I'm going to sloth milk. So I'm now to the 3rd lineage and say, okay, this is now an herbivore. I've gone way away. I've gone from essentially insectivores to herbivores. So based on diet, you could make an argument that it should have a different looking milk, okay? You could argue that there's not much simple sugar and carbohydrate in their diet, so maybe they're going to have a tough time putting sugar in milk. And even though the diet's low in fat, of course they're doing fermentation, which creates a lot of short-chain fatty acids. So they could get a lot of short-chain fatty acids. They should have some fat in there. So looking at diet and phylogeny, I said, okay, phylogeny says it's going to be a milk high in protein. Only phylogeny says that. None of the rest of the stuff says that, but phylogeny says that. And I think that most of the energy is going to come from fat and protein because I can't see a good way for this animal. This animal's not going to be like a primate. It's not going to have a lot of sugar in its milk. Okay, so that was my prediction. We were able to get samples from Staten Island Zoo. Very intriguing scenario. This female is apparently so relaxed amongst people. There was a video of her when they were showing off the baby at first with her hanging from the keeper's arm. Hanging from the keeper's arm with a 2-day-old baby on it. And somebody actually had the veterinarian from this, person from this zoo was actually at a practical zoo nutrition course that I was helping teach. And she said, Mike, we could get some milk for you. And they contacted the vet. And that keeper just would sit there and hold the mom and just collect milk. So it was a really, really cool, fun thing to happen. Again, sugar is pretty consistent. It's usually about 2.5 to 3.5% for all of these critters. Had more fat in the milk than I expected. And maybe it's because this is a captive animal. Maybe it's a well-fed animal. There could be some changing there. But once again, protein was the highest constituent. Protein coming out about 14%, 40% of energy coming in. So now I can go back to my geometric framework. I put a whole bunch of different mammalian species in here. I put the line of 40% energy from protein here to see it, to show you that not many mammals get there. Most mammals are more around the 20% line. That's the line for 20%. Elephants were below the 20% line. Monkeys are right on the 20% line. Humans are on about the 12% line. Okay. Giant anteaters sitting off here way, like amazingly different. But later in lactation, the milk moves this way. So the end part of lactation, more and more fat seems to come into the milk. And you basically move up into this area here. But there's my armadillo. There's my sloth. That's African lion, an absolute obligate carnivore. That's the aardvark, which is another anteater. This guy here is California sea lion. So a marine mammal, tons of fat in the milk and whatever. So I actually have a very intriguing little scenario here that it's giving me a couple ideas of things. First of all, if you want me to make a bet on where pangolin milk is going to fall, I'm going to bet pangolin milk is falling right in here as well. Okay, I'm betting a lot of my insectivores are going to fall into that sort of picture, just as an insectivore piece of the puzzle in there. But it also means that even my herbivore that's a xenarthran is falling into that place. So speculations. The first one is this is a phylogenetic constraint. The common ancestor of all these species had a high protein milk. Therefore, they're going to continue to have a high protein milk. And it works. Sloths are existing. They can actually raise their babies on it. It's basically that's what you are where you are. You can't necessarily get from one milk to another easily in terms of evolution. So basically, I'm suggesting that the common ancestor is going to have a high protein milk. That allowed, it's a pre-adaptation, is what we call osteoderms. So osteoderms are forming of bone in skin, all right? And not only do armadillos do that, so the entire armadillo lineage is there for that, but the giant ground sloths, so the extinct giant ground sloths, several species of extinct giant ground sloths have had osteoderms. They've actually found these subfossil pelages, hides, and they actually have bony plates in their skin. So it's not just armadillos in the xenarthrans that have this thing of going in there. But once again, it fits. It fits with having osteoderms. It fits with their high protein, low energy diet. Allows them to grow, has a fast growth rate for neonates without high energy turnover because they got a lot of protein in there to go for it. Probably means all of them use protein for energy quite a bit. And lots of animals do that. I mean, cats are great at that. Primates are horrible at it. We do a really bad job of doing that, but many animals do it. And so then I'm going, okay, so what has this told me now about potentially the ancestral placental mammal milk, knowing this? So what I've got here is I'm pretty sure of what I'm going to look at here. Not exactly, but at least I'm saying protein is going to be deriving most of the energy. It's going to be probably around 40%, maybe higher, something in that range here. What does that mean from here? Well, I'm going to have to look more at Afrotherians to see what I can have, but certainly I have a aardvark that would go up there and fit to that. Does that give me any help to get here and make the argument that this is going to be a high protein milk? Well, it certainly gives me a bit of a leg to stand on. And then the other, of course, leg to stand on is by going further back in time to about 195 million years ago. And this is what we think the ancestor of mammals looks like. A small nocturnal insectivore, which, by the way, would have no nipples, but would lactate. And so from looking at just that xenarthran thing, I've got a path to sort of try to recreate what I think, at least in some aspect of the ancestral milk, at least for the placental mammals. And then we have questions that can go anywhere as far as I'm concerned. So you let me just have my fun and go talk. So now you can ask me anything you want.
Mike, can we stop share and come back together for questions?
Yep. Yep. So I need to stop share. There we go.
All right. Whoa, that was trippy. What do we have? Robin was interested in why she wasn't like a cow and got skinny when she was breastfeeding. I think that was a joke, but she thought that was funny.
I do have an intriguing story on things for human lactation and in the history of it and what they learned. Some of the first studies were done in England, nutritional studies, And they were, based on that, they came up with the expected increase in food intake a lactating woman should have in order to successfully breastfeed and keep her body weight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they went out into Ghana, Africa, and they looked at a whole bunch of successful lactating women who never changed their diet at all, who lactated, went through the thing without ever increasing food intake. They didn't have the option to increase food intake. And what they discovered was these Ghanaian women worked hard. They worked very hard. They were always going to the water place to get water. They're in the field. And when they were lactating, instead of going to the water place 5 or 6 times a day, they went once or twice a day. And when they were in the fields, they did less. In other words, they cut their energy expenditure. And when they finally looked at it, the scientists came to the conclusion that, gee, for the Western women in the UK, they didn't have enough energy expenditure to cut.
Okay, let's see. We have a couple of questions. Christian or Christiana, what makes a milk exotic? I guess. Why are they called exotic?
Oh, the exotic is just as non-domesticated animals, basically. So, but I shouldn't quite be that, because I have dog milk, and I have human milk, and I don't know if we can call ourselves exotic or not. So actually, it should be just the milk repository. I think of it as just the milk repository in that sense. But we use that word just to sort of get the idea out there that, yeah, we have aardvark to zebra. So.
Eric says, does milk composition vary across a species range?
As in the different, where the species might be?
Well, Eric, you want to come on and say what you, explain that a little bit more?
A quick answer on some things, if you're talking about a species milk, is there are some species in which I see almost no variation in milks. Ringtail lemurs, I had a whole bunch of different females. They all look the same. And in fact, brown lemurs, a related species, but not that closely related, look the same too. I couldn't tell them apart whatsoever. Some of the females had twins, some of them had singletons, couldn't tell anything at all about the milk. Yeah. There are other milks like the common marmoset. Yes, Eric, are you?
Yeah, sorry, it took me a while to get off mute there. No, I was curious for species with very broad ranges where they might have variations in diet and also climate, would that affect the milk composition?
Yeah. Again, some species have very little variation that goes on in there. Primates are not very variable. Though my common marmoset that I study a lot, I've seen milks with 0.5% fat and ones up to 9 and 10% fat. So and that's maternal body condition that's probably driving that. So maternal body condition can drive changes in there. Diet can drive certainly some aspects of it, but not others. Some aspects seem to be very strongly held together. The mineral composition of milk really doesn't depend on diet, because the mineral composition, especially the calcium and phosphorus composition of milk, comes from bone. So a lactating mammal loses bone. There was nothing we can do about it. There was a large piece of public health concern in the 90s for women when they said, oh my goodness, women are losing 3 to 10% of their bone every time they're breastfeeding. Wow, we should worry about that. Let's give them calcium supplements. If you give them calcium supplements, you increase the calcium content of their urine. They just pee it out. Because the whole scenario is the hormonal setting of lactation encourages the release of calcium and phosphorus from bone. And so it's an adaptive thing. That's the way mammals seem to have done it. A rat mother actually loses close to 30% of her bone mineral in lactating. As soon as she finishes lactating, she puts it all right back on again. So epidemiologically, women who have breastfed have just as good skeletons when they're 70-year-olds as women who haven't breastfed. Doesn't seem to have any long-term effect. But short-term, yes, you can actually have more risk of fractures of a woman if she has had bad bones to begin with and she's lactating. So there's certain populations populations that could be vitamin D deficient, things like that. There are certain populations we actually do worry about it when they're lactating, because they'd be at higher risk of having a bone fracture.
Mason?
Would you like me to ask my question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I put, what's the hardest milk to collect that you've had to collect? And the first thing that came to my mind was when you were talking about monotremes, and I remember hearing they more or less kind of sweat milk. So like that must have been
Yeah,
difficult.
that apparently, I haven't collected all the milks. They get collected for me. That apparently wasn't too difficult to get in there. But yes, monotremes don't have any nipples. They just have a patch in which basically the milk comes out of. The evolution of a nipple was apparently an incredibly important aspect that occurred like 140 million years ago in there. Some of the trickiest milks, we have milk from tigers. And that was it was collected actually with the tiger being awake, and they had trained the tiger to lie on a platform to allow for ultrasound exams during pregnancy, and they got her to lie down there and reach very cautiously up to actually twiddle with the nipples and get milk. So there's a tricky one there. Giant anteater apparently is difficult in its way in that the animals are usually pretty easy to handle and don't mind and everything, but apparently the milk squirts all over everywhere. And the National Zoo, we ended up with more milk on the floor than we did in any of our containers. Some species you can get milk very easily from, like rhinos, you just put them in a chute and tug on the nipples and you can get milk. Some species, you actually have to inject them with oxytocin or you're not going to get milk let down. All right. Or in the case of an elephant, if the calf isn't there nursing, you don't get any milk. As soon as the calf comes and hits one of the nipples, you can actually hear the milk let down and you can fill a bucket at that point. But if the calf's not there, you're not going to get any.
Well, your talk about the evolution of nipples, that sounds fascinating in and of itself, and it kind of goes into what Joanne was asking, why are nipples located in different areas of the body for different species?
Yeah, well, they're all in the ventrum, so they're all in the front, and a lot of it, of course, depends on the number, the usual number of babies you're going to have. Though the lowest number is always 2 because we are bilaterally symmetric in that case. But basically, animals that have litters will have more nipples than so pigs have a heck of a lot of nipples, and primates basically have 2 nipples. Even my wonderful marmosets that routinely twin and sometimes have triplets only have 2 nipples. That's what they're stuck with. And it seems to have come from the fact that the glands came from the ventrum, which always goes back to the thing of basically an animal coming and lying on eggs and excreting on eggs. And then that's where the gland structures came to. And then the gland structures have slowly evolved and gained more and more. Now, it'd be interesting to see, of course, when you get to the marsupials or pouches, of course, those you've got nipples inside pouches. So I actually don't know enough about that, how they're situated and everything. That, of course, is very intriguing from there because like a kangaroo can have 2 joeys at once of different ages, and producing different milks from the different nipples that the joeys are on. Completely different milks.
Crazy. And we're still on nipples here. But species without nipples, how does that work? And how do you keep the samples? Are they frozen or refrigerated?
Samples are kept frozen. A majority of the samples are in our walk-in -2, -20 freezer. But the pristine and best samples are in a -80. And I have 2 -80 freezers. I have one that I have almost full, and I have one that is, I believe, still empty right now because it's my backup just in case, because any power situation has or something happen, I've got to be able to shift for other guys. It's possible my -80 freezer right now has COVID-19 vaccine in it for display because I offered it up since I had a free -80 and those vaccines need it.
And then let's see, whale milk. Do you have any whale milk? And as in from the belugas at a place like Mystic Aquarium up in Connecticut?
We have various whale milk, some from the wild, some from captive. We have orca milk. We have a lot of dolphin milk. We had gray whale. Trying to think of what other ones we have. Bowfin, I think. We didn't have many samples. Most of those were collected from wild animals in different projects from there. Most of them are fairly old samples. The orca though was captive. Those were captive animals that were and that was an interesting thing because when we did the first milk microbiome, we actually looked at more than 50 different species across all 4 superorders. And one of the strongest separations for what the milk microbiome looked like was whether it was a terrestrial animal or a marine animal. They actually had very different ones. And the orcas set off even weird by themselves. And my interest thought there is maybe that's because they're actually a captive one and actually not under the same circumstances of most of my other ones are wild. Most of my marine animals were wild milks. The seals and sea lions and the dolphins. A few of the dolphins were captive, but most of the ones we looked at were wild animals. And so I sort of wondered whether captivity were actually affecting one piece of their biology by in there. But still, it was kind of intriguing. And in the end, not that surprising because the marine environment is so different from the terrestrial environment.
Sure. And
including the microbes and how microbes can get to places. It's a completely different environment in there. So in hindsight, I'm going, well, yeah, that's kind of a duh. I suspect if we start looking at their gut microbiomes, it's probably going to be really different. This probably show the difference between marine and terrestrial as well.
Eric is interested. Do you drink milk?
Do I drink milk personally? Yes, I'm a major milk drinker. I liked milk as a kid, and then actually as a very young kid, between the ages of 6 and 8, my family was in Karachi, Pakistan, and there was no access to milk except they had powdered milk, and I couldn't stand powdered milk, and I hated powdered milk. And then when I got back to the United States and tasted actual good old milk, because I lived in Williamstown, Massachusetts, we used to get milk from a dairy, right? I mean, the old style of getting milk from a dairy. And that was it. And so my young brain just went boom. And so, yes, I am a major drinker of milk. I drink, these days I have in the house is one of the organic grass-fed cow milks because it reminds me a heck of a lot of what I used to drink when I was young. But yeah, I can go through a half a gallon a day if I get into it.
Ruan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I guess you're talking about the recombinant stuff. So actually, if it's okay, when you're talking about dolphin stuff, another sort of thought ran through my head because I wasn't sure. There's several like river dolphins that are like in jeopardy of becoming extinct species, and then there are actually some like that aren't around anymore. My question related to that matter is sort of almost in a similar vein as some things might be asked about, like a zoo arc of DNA being archived. Is there a kind of a thought of preserving, I guess, exotic milks in the same aspect that if it was to be a time where a habitat and species was restored,
well,
to assist that process?
At the moment, I mean, the milk collection exists as a science collection. And actually my goal is to not have frozen samples. My goal is to have databases of information. Yeah. So I'm attempting to turn as much of my frozen samples into information as I can.
Right. But I guess in that same mindset, if almost, I don't know what kind of tests they do, but almost like do a HPLC or mass spec breakdown of the composition of some really exotic milk just to have as a database record of
and like I say, I've got over 200 species, and what are there? Over 6,000 species of mammals. So I mean, I'm scrambling like crazy, and it comes down to what I get. There was somebody who actually tried to publish a paper on the content of the Amazon River dolphin
Mhm.
from that. But unfortunately, what they were doing, the only way they were collecting them is they were finding dead females and then
Yeah.
collecting the milk from there. And they published it, and I took one, and they got sent to me for review, and I took one look at it and said, "You've got milk that had bacteria hit in it, and it's turning the sugar in the." I mean, it's you're making all these statements about what it is, and I'm going, no,
Not
you
valid.
don't necessarily have real milk anymore. You've got.
Right.
I had that happen. We got milk from mountain gorillas, wild mountain gorillas, and one of them, the researcher in there says, "Wow, this one looks so different, Mike. It's just like it's high in protein and low in sugar." And I said, "Okay, let's find out what this female was." He says, "Oh yeah, that was a female we had to euthanize, and she was full of basically full of infection, and she had mastitis." And I said, "Then that wasn't milk anymore. I mean, it was milk like you left out on the counter, and the bacteria got to it." So. Yeah, there is I'm trying to get as many as I can. The easiest milks to get are ones that animals are already in captivity. That's always the easiest to get. We do have milk from wild animals. We work with researchers to do that in the field, to do that when we can.
Or just also have as a
Pangolin
baseline
milk, like
human milk also maybe as a
well,
easy access thing to.
There's all sorts of things in human milk. They got human milk banks these days on there, though they treat that milk. So some of it can't be used for certain things because they have to treat it because they're using it to feed to, say, babies in the NICU and preterm babies and things like that. And so they have to make sure, again, first do no harm, because there's lots of things in milk and not all of, and the things can get into milk that are not good as well as good. One example of that, I'll just run by you, is seals have big blubber layers, right? And what happens with some seals, especially like in the Mediterranean, they were seeing this, is that a lot of the sort of like PCP type contaminants and everything get sequestered into the blubber layers. So they're not really harming the adult. They're being sequestered, but they're in the blubber layers. The first time a mom gives birth and mobilizes a lot of fat into the milk, basically probably produces a lot of milk with a lot of toxins, and usually the first babies die. After that, she's liberated most of it from her out of her system, and therefore subsequent babies are okay. But you're basically causing the death of the first baby every time because of the accumulated toxins from the environment that are in the blood.
I guess if I can ask really quickly, you don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but just so I air the question out for curious minds later to think about. Has there been any tinkering around with the recombinant modifications to create formulas intended for various modified zoo nursery dietary care kind of scenarios?
Yes.
Oh.
The dairy industry is doing all sorts of things, but the more interesting thing to me is there's a set of different companies. I'm only going to remember one of them off top. Google Turtle Tree Labs. Turtle Tree Labs are based in Singapore. They have developed a system by which they produce milk in the lab from mammary cells. And they're producing human milk to start with, but they're considering looking at producing milk for endangered species in the same way from doing that. And have then now branched off to attempt to produce certain particular bioactive ingredients that are in milk that they think of important by inserting the genes into fungi and actually having then the microbes basically pump out a various peptide or sugar or whatever into milk. And there are other companies that are also doing some of these things as well. So they're not the only company out there, though. They're the only one that I know of that's really gotten to actually essentially producing a culture of what's a fake mammary gland from fake cells and being able to do it. And they're, of course, trying to make it a business operation and figure out what to do with that. They're trying to make the best designer baby formula you could possibly have, of course, by doing that. But they're also now actually trying to stretch out into producing effectively human milk products for adults, taking some of the things and saying, fine, let's spread it all out on here. And
for like third world situations, I mean, it's it's
Well,
relevant for that.
One of the earliest things they said to me was that they almost apologized for it, but they said, we're here at Singapore, we're very, very near China. Middle class and wealthy Chinese women do not want to breastfeed, but they don't trust the formula they can buy in China. So they come to Singapore and pay ridiculous prices for Western things. So they were going to attempt to make a better one for that market. Of course, when I hear what they're doing as a scientist, I just go, oh my God, this is amazing, because they now have a thing where you could take those set of cells and change the circumstances and see what happens. You can actually test without any of the sort of animal rights things. That's not, it's just a set of cells. And you could sit there and say, wow, we could actually start figuring out how these glands work, what the genetics are, what the triggers are. To me, this is an incredible thing for science, but of course that's not going to make them enough money, though. So they smile at me when I say that. So,
but even on the pilot scale, it is pretty amazing. I
oh
guess,
yeah, it's very exciting, just because they are really diving into the biology now at the cellular level and trying to figure out what's going on. So we're
okay, cool.
Technology is just racing. It's just racing.
Thank you.
Janina is wants to know about the nut milks and grain milks. What do you think about those, nutritionally speaking?
They're probably fine. If you like them and everything, I grimace when they call themselves milk, but I guess you can. It's just a terminology. Almond milk and all those sorts of things. I mean, I don't drink them myself, and I don't look at them, so I haven't looked at the nutrition labels to see what it is. Obviously, if you have any kind of nut allergies, I suggest you stay away from them. It's sort of the obvious statement. But again, there's all sorts of foods that we can make. I mean, again, technology is doing wonderful things in terms of making different foods. So I have no problem with any of that. I mean, the simplest modification of milk was they have all those milks with lactate added. So they take the lactose out, because most adults can't break down lactose. I happen to be of the genetic lineage that does just fine with it, which is like why I can drink tons of milk. So there's a whole set of Europeans. There's also a whole set of West Africans. It's a totally different gene mutation, but there's a whole set of ancient herder people from West Africa who are also lactose tolerant all through life. But the majority of people, if you drink too much milk, your stomach's not going to feel too good.
What is, if you could get milk from any mammal out there, what is the quintessential one that's out there that's waiting for you that you want?
My biggest wish list, my biggest wish list, which I've just barely gotten some in, is pangolin.
Okay.
Pangolin is one of the biggest ones because they're extremely endangered. They're everything. And the other thing, they're another anteater. So they're another anteater to fit into this pattern. They look like an armored one, but that armor is not bone. That armor is actually modified hair. It's scales that are modified hair. And so you get into an interesting biology. So I am now making a quick prediction that their milk is going to be much more like a giant anteater's milk.
Right.
It's going to be high in protein, but it's not going to be high in casein protein. It's going to be high in the whey proteins. And if you don't mind my jumping into biochemistry really quickly here, in your amino acids, there's a certain kind of amino acids called the sulfur amino acids. That's methionine and cysteine. Sulfur amino acids make great disulfide bonds. Obviously, disulfide bonds from the sulfur amino acids. When you do that, you form long, rigid structures. That's what makes hair. That's what makes spines. That's what makes probably the scales that are in a pangolin. Okay. Casein proteins are deficient in sulfur amino acids because they're trying to make balls. You do not want to have long, rigid structures. So if you're high in casein proteins, you're going to have a trouble with your sulfur amino acids. If I had high casein protein for, say, like a porcupine, I'd have trouble because I wouldn't have enough to make the disulfide bonds to make the things. And so that's one thing we're actually looking at echidnas when they're having trouble raising baby echidnas when they had to. They grow just fine, and then they start having spine malformations. And so the nutritionist over there, I talked with her and we discussed it. We finally came down. I think it's working now. We said, well, you just have to bump up the sulfur amino acids to help the spine formation. And so again, the pangolin to me, so the giant anteater is making a shaggy coat. The pangolin is taking that to another extent of turning into an armored, but it's still a hair coat. And that's going to be different from the armadillo. So that's really why I'd love to have a lot of penguin milk. That and the fact that poor penguins are so under. I'm afraid I'm not going to get a chance to have penguin milk unless I are getting some.
Yeah, we gotta stop that somehow. I don't know how, but that's a topic for another day.
They unfortunately look too much like little baby dragons, and people just their minds are going the wrong place as to what they are.
Well, Dr. Power, thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. It was a fascinating deep dive insight into what mammals and milk and evolution and how we got to where we are going, and finding interesting answers in milk. I'm never going to look at a glass of milk the same way.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I'm still happily here doing it as a scientist, because milk is a place where every time you look, you find more questions and more places to look, because there's such great, amazing diversity, and everything is so interconnected.
Yeah, it's like there's magic in that milk, and it's fascinating, especially when you feed one milk from one mother to another, and it's all different, comes out the different ways. It's fascinating. Thank you so much. And let's see. Oh, let's see. There's one more question here. Lactobacillus.
He was just making the comment of all the things to do in the milk in there and all that sort of stuff.
Okay. That was a comment, not a question. All right.
If you'll please just allow me one quick last story, because it's caught in there. Okay. You all know what cottage cheese is, right? Curds and whey. All right. That's a separation of milk into the clumps, and then the whey is the liquid part that goes out. That is how neonatal mammals digest milk. When milk hits the stomach, this huge flood of liquid, you have an enzyme called chymosin, which breaks open the casein things, which causes clumping, which causes the curds to come out and fall out, and then the liquid portion continues on through the system. So that's why when the animal drinks a lot of milk, it all doesn't go rushing through the system, because you actually precipitate out a curd.
Wow.
It's just like the cottage cheese curds, and then that slowly digests in the system. And that's just, to me, once again, putting it all together, you can't just look at the milk. You got to look at how the infant then treats the milk to go on to the next step. Humans, adults don't probably make much chymosin in there, but we have a more acidic stomach than a baby does, and the acid will do it as well. So you take a glass of milk and drop lemon juice into it, and you'll watch the curds form. So acid will do it in itself, but the pH of a human infant stomach is about 4. The pH of our stomach is about 2. And 4 is about the best place for chymosin to work. So the babies are doing the same thing as we would do as an adult, but they do it in a different way. And that digested milk starts by curdling it and allowing the liquid portion then to flow on, but keeping a solid portion in the stomach.
There's so much. We're gonna maybe have to come back and continue this conversation on milk.
Yeah, it's the problem. You got me to start talking about milk.
Thanks everybody for coming out and learning with us. Now take that knowledge and share it with other people and make them smarter. And hopefully you can join us next week. I believe it is for the story about the wild turkeys in Maryland, which should be interesting. It's a conservation success story. So that's when we're looking for some good news. There you go. Stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you later. Stay curious.
And Ron, yes, I do have penguin milk from Brookfield. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Thank you, Mike.